like Miley. Twerking like Miley. Twerking like Miley. Twerking like
Called squash and stretch, and it's pretty self-explanatory in terms of what it's talking about. And as you can see in my demonstration example thingy here, we have a couple of characters that are sort of stretching and squashing. The purpose of squashing and stretching your characters, or whatever you're animating, is to communicate that there are physics in play, that whatever you're animating has weight to it. And when something is stretching in the direction of its arc of motion, it's being moved with great force, and we're exaggerating that momentum and force with our stretch. And then, of course, with every action having an equal and opposite reaction, when we reach the end point of our animation stretch and the huge amount of motion that is then going in this direction with that stretch, the equal and opposite reaction is that the physical body of the object that we're animating in that motion is then compacted in that direction, and that results in a squash. Now, this can then unfold into a continual motion. So in this example, we have the monkey bouncing off and stretching slightly in the other direction, or it can, of course, just end. And this monkey might, for example, have just sat up or rolled over after this point. So its applications can vary. In this example, the left and central example are both very literal examples of a squash and stretch. We have a character who's sort of stretched out, and then we have a character who's squashed. But this example is a little bit funky. It's applying a technique called an animation smear, and that's where we can take the geometry of something and stretch it out to the point of irrecognizability. And often we can do things like add multiple elements of that geometry to accentuate the motion or rapid movement being applied. So in context of our animation, the initial bounce into the frame has a stretch along our initial arc of motion, which continues along until we hit our point of collision, and then the monkey continues along another arc of motion, stretching slightly along this one, but not as much as our first one, because that's where the most impact is applied. Our arc of motion continues until, of course, there is another collision point, and as you can see, there is another squash. Where previously the head of the monkey was more circular, so in the height of the arc of motion, the monkey's head is circular. Where stretching, it becomes elliptical in the direction of the stretch, and then in the squash, it of course squashes in the direction of the squash. So this principle can be applied in extremity and in subtlety, and in the opening shot of the monkey bouncing into the frame, it's used in some extremity. But there are some examples. For example, here when he sits up, we get some slight stretching in the head and the face. We also see an animation smear here happening. The monkey doesn't have three noses, but for the space of 2 frames, he does. And that's because in the frame preceding this motion, the monkey's eyes and nose are at the very top of his facial line, so his eye line is quite high, and then 3 frames later, his eye line is lower and more central. So to communicate this motion being fairly rapid, I've used an animation smear to stretch the geometry and help aid that feeling of speed and motion. As the animation continues, we get this monkey head shake, and you can see this application of animation smears being used quite a lot. In fact, in all of the frames of the head shake, the monkey has 3 noses, and in every central head shake frame, it has 2 sets of squinting eyes, and the facial geometry is quite stretched. So this is an application of an animation smear to sort of emphasize that motion taking place. Here is another example of a stretch of the circle into an elliptical shape as he arches back, and then we have an extreme stretch until he squashes and bounces back as he looks forward. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the motion only takes place in 1 frame. So we actually have the preceding frame where he's arched completely back and his head is circular and round, and then we have one frame in between until he's circular again and leaning forward. So this single frame in between communicates the entire motion. So within this one image, we're using as much as we can to make the most of it. And really, if we didn't have these warps of geometry, it could end up making the image of the animation look a bit flat. So by stretching out the geometry in the range of the arc of motion where he's looking forward, and in applying animation smears, as you can see with the hands and with elements of the face, we get that motion quite emphasized. This continues on throughout our later part of the animation. So as he arcs back, we have some smearing in the mouth, multiple mouth lines, and some stretching in the hairlines as the entire body sort of smears as the legs kick back and eventually rests in its resting position. But even before it hits its resting position, we have a squash, because this arc of motion in the kick up sort of goes around and down like this. So by the time it's hitting its down point here, there's a slight squash because the motion is abruptly stopped. Then once the motion continues again, we have an extreme smear and stretch in the direction of the arc of motion once again until he hits the ground, and as you can see, we have another squash of the head on a vertical axis. So the circular head becomes elliptical but shorter, and he then bounces back into his normal position. So this area of animation where he's bouncing into the frame and then shakes his head and then stands up is the most applicable in terms of using elements of squash and stretch, because it's also the most extreme. But you can also apply squash and stretch in a much more subtle way. So for example, here with the characters bouncing up and down, walking off angrily, there are subtle elements of squash and stretch through his limbs as he stretches out to reach and touch the ground, and through his head as he bounces down, and in his hair and other elements of his animation. But it's much more subtle, and I suppose you could say the most interesting applications of the squash and stretch principle are in the most extreme motions, because that's where it really works wonders and helps emphasize and exaggerate the motion in a way that couldn't otherwise be done. And that's, I suppose, the magic of animation, really, that we have that power in our hands to create such exaggerated expressions and movements. It's said that the principle of squash and stretch is one of the most important principles of animation, and one that would be required to be mastered as it would be used the most often. And I can sort of vouch for that in the sense that I use it all the time, and it is a huge aid to applying emphasis and interest to your animation. Thanks for watching through this tutorial, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.